Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. If I sound funny, I'm sure it's not because of anything I'm saying. It's because I'm in a loud room with a handheld microphone at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm here with brother Chris Stirewalt, and we are doing a special live taping of the Remnant before the Summer Honors Program urchins. Here at AEI, they're all going to end up becoming part of the globalist elite, and I'll either be working for them or dead by their hand at some point. It's actually a great program. If any of you out there, am I right? It's a great program. Yeah. That's the last call and response we'll be doing. So we're going to do a little rank punditry, and maybe some life advice, and then we'll do some Q&A, and whether we can get that into the recording, we'll see how the sound quality goes. Everyone should know that it is a classically horrible weather day in D.C. I do these weather forecasts about what it's going to be like for the day, and today, if I had done it on Twitter, it would have been something along the lines of an unair-conditioned necrophiliac brothel in Rangoon during the rainy season. It's very unpleasant, and the very air assaults the nostrils. So with that, Chris, it's great to have you.
Well, with that setup, how could it not be good? And I think that you've not been gratuitous enough in milking the live audience element of it. So in a count of three, I'm going to ask you to applaud and make a lot of noise so that people know that we're not just having bad sound quality, but this is actually happening. So in 3, 2, 1, go. Okay, that's all. Yes, there we go. And what was it, a necrophiliac brothel in Rangoon?
Yes, unair conditioned.
Oh, obviously,
Yeah.
to make it unair conditioned, yes.
Anyway, all right, enough of the Coldplay references. So, where to begin? So it's funny, I just recorded this podcast, which will air after this, because that's how time travel's weird. With our friend Ross Douthat from the New York Times, and at the very end, we talked briefly about Elon Musk's idea of an America Party, which every time you say America Party, they should dub in the sound of an eagle screeching. We both turned out, wrote almost the exact same thing in our views on it. So I'm feeling like you're going to come down squarely in violent agreement with me and Ross, but I will not gild it more than that. What do you think of the idea?
As we saw with the third way / no labels, there's a huge market. The analogy I always use, people say, when are we going to have a third party? And I say, if we say to everybody in this room, if you tell everybody in this room that we're going to Applebee's for dinner, and then I say, we don't want Applebee's, do we? We want to go someplace else. Someplace else is going to score really high compared to Applebee's. And then I'll say, yeah, Jonah, we've got 80% of the room wants someplace else. And that's great until I say, and we're going to Denny's. And then the rest of you are like, wait a minute. And then now we've got the 20% for Denny's, the 20% for Applebee's, and then you still have the 60% that wants someplace else. The biggest news on this project right now is that the Supreme Court is going to take up a case that may remove limits on contributions to political parties. So the single worst piece of legislation, yeah, I think that's still true. We are creating new competition for the single worst piece of legislation in my adult life. But the McCain-Feingold Campaign Finance Reform Act was one of the most damaging bad things that happened in American politics. It was followed by what I think was rightly decided Supreme Court decision on the Citizens United case that said you can't regulate speech, you can't say what time of the year you're allowed to say what things. And what it did was diverted all the money away from political parties, and it went to unaccountable super PACs. And something that in the on the matter of violent agreement, where Brother Goldberg and I have been together, is we need stronger, better parties. The reason that we have such awful partisanship and destructive partisanship is that the parties themselves, the institutions themselves, are very, very weak. And part of the reason that they're weak, it's not a sufficient explanation, but part of the explanation is that campaign finance reform steered money away from parties and it went to super PACs that people don't have to name and claim. You just create a super PAC that's called the USA Freedom Dude Super PAC. You dump a bunch of money in it, you spend it, and then when the race is over, you either keep it going or you fold it up and move on. If the Supreme Court rules as it might and says that parties can have the same opportunities basically that super PACs do and that they can get the money back, there's a chance that the parties might get stronger. Elon Musk, if he wanted to do the most good for the system, wouldn't be coming up with a third party that would compete in general elections typically, but to choose candidate by candidate to go through in the Republican and Democratic primaries and create different tensions in the race. But as far as a general election, third party, I don't know, there's a lot of young men in this room. And young men are highly disaffected with both parties and they tend to like Elon Musk and stuff. So maybe there's a young dudes party that might form, but I'm very skeptical.
So much to my surprise, you've actually come at this from a different place. So here's my take on it. And I still don't think you're going to disagree very much. The political historian Richard Hofstadter, who I've got my issues with, probably his most famous line of kind of political punditry is that third parties are like bees. They have their effect by stinging and then they die. And if you look at the history of third parties in this country, they mostly, Donald Trump was wrong when he said third parties never work because he's actually the head of the most successful third party in American history. The Republican Party doesn't get created until 1854. By 1860, the Whig Party is gone, and Abraham Lincoln is the first Republican president. They had a pretty good run at it. But normally what happens is, and this is what Hofstadter was really getting at, is that third parties tend to hurt the party they're most closely associated with. And the signature event of this was 1912, where Teddy Roosevelt creates the Bull Moose Party, also called the Progressive Party, which splits the Republican vote, and then we get the worst president, history's greatest monster, Woodrow Wilson becoming president of the United States. But for that, the world would be a better place. And Ross Perot, there's a debate. I don't know where you come down on. Did Ross Perot cost George H.W. Bush the 92 election or not?
I think it's safe to say that he certainly didn't help.
He didn't help. Yes, that's right. And I think it's settled, though. There's not a debate that Nader almost surely cost Gore Florida.
Well, I vehemently disagree with the idea that spoiler candidates. Perot is more challenging. Perot got 18% of the vote, and for a period of time in the summer of 1992 was actually leading, was actually ahead. Perot was a contender. When we talk about third-party candidates, we talk about a viability threshold where below a certain number, and this tends to be 10 or 12%, below a certain number, they're not a viable candidate, and the number actually goes down. And what it goes down to are ideological purists and protest votes. People who say, like a lot of people have done since 2016, I can't vote for this one, I can't vote for that one, so I'm going to lodge my vote like the David French candidacy of 2016.
Too soon.
Too soon.
Yeah.
No, but it's a place to park your vote, right? A third party can be just a place to park your vote. I don't want to give my assent to either of these choices, so I'm going to park my vote over here and hope I send a message. That's what the Libertarian Party did and has done for a long time in American politics. The idea that you would cross the viability threshold. So that's a long way of saying Ralph Nader didn't cost Al Gore the election. Al Gore cost Al Gore the election. The people who went and voted for Ralph Nader, I highly doubt, said, well, if Ralph Nader wasn't on the ticket, I guess I'll vote for Al Gore. They can not vote. They can undervote. They can write in Chewbacca. They can do whatever they want. But there's not much evidence to suggest that protest vote, and I'm touchy about this because there's been so much in the 2016, 2020, 24 about if you don't vote for my preferred candidate, it's actually a vote for the other person. And it's like nobody owns those votes. Those are just people who.
Oh, I agree with that as a philosophical matter, as someone who has not voted for Trump once. I don't feel like I had any obligation.
He hasn't voted for him once. He's voted for him 5 times.
And I get your point about, the cheap electoral analysis, show me on the doll, Mr. Stirewalt, where the bad election analysis hurt you.
Right.
I don't want to get into all of that. But my only point is, I think Ralph Nader got something like 90,000 votes in Florida. Al Gore lost Florida by
437 votes.
Yeah, so if 1 out of 20 of those people, whatever. Anyway, the point is that third parties tend to hurt the party they're closer to ideologically. And if I had to bet, Musk doesn't even file the paperwork to do this thing.
Well,
has he?
So paperwork has been filed by...
But not all the paperwork.
Not all the paperwork, but an FEC filing has been made under that name by a senior executive at Tesla.
Excellent.
Is it the thing? And that's part of the problem with Musk is he's a vapor, right? Is this true? Is this a troll? Is this the Katy Perryification of American politics being, here are dancing sharks behind me. If you like it, then I meant it and I'm sincere about dancing sharks. If you don't like it, I was just doing it for the lulz. Just
right.
JK.
Yeah. All right, that's fair. Anyway, so enormously difficult to get on ballots. I think most of the people who say there's not a dime worth of difference between the Republican and Democratic Party are full of nonsense. But there's one area where they really do collude with each other powerfully, and that is to maintain the two-party duopoly in state election laws. All of that said, so I don't think it's going to go anywhere. My only point is that if you were going to give this a shot of doing something, what he has stated is the way he's going to do it is not dumb and has a chance of having an actual effect, which is he says he's going to concentrate on 2 or 3 or 4 Senate races and 8 to 10 House races. Given how close the House and the Senate are, if you actually had people who were running on a platform of, I don't answer to either party, blah, 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 you could actually see the American Party caucus becoming a power center in the House and the Senate. And even if I might not agree with them on everything, I think that would be to the good because it would reintroduce this obscure, strange idea called coalitional politics to the House and the Senate. And that would be for the better for the country.
The Progressive Party's most consequential action was, of course, delivering the presidency to Woodrow Wilson. But its biggest accomplishment was being a block of votes in Congress, right? So people like Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, and there were actual progressives, and they were, if you'll excuse me, a third way inside politics, and they were this other group. They were this transpartisan entity that some of them were progressive left and some were progressive right, like Teddy Roosevelt, but they were basically a party and a caucus. And I think that was some of the thinking behind the no labels movement was both a party and a caucus. But I will say that Elon Musk has the same problem that no labels did, which is successful political movements. When Ross Perot started the Reform Party, he went to extraordinary pains to give it the appearance of a ground-up movement, right? So there was a group called United We Stand that Perot had started in his efforts to get the POWs out of Vietnam. And he worked very hard to be drafted right? He didn't run. He didn't say, I'm doing it. He created this organization, and the organization did ballot access, and it did all this stuff, which put Perot in the position of being able to say, well, I don't want to do it, but I guess if y'all are dragging me in, I guess I'll go. Whereas what I hear from Musk and what I heard from No Labels is people saying, we know better than what you know, and we're going to tell you how to do it. We're going to come in and tell you how to do it. I don't think that in our populistic era that is the right energy.
No, I think that's probably right. All right, we can move off third parties now because I can feel the audience saying third parties boring, losing consciousness.
No, it's the heater. I can feel it in here. People want to talk about it. Yeah.
And it's easy for us to forget, but like all these people were born decades after Ross Perot.
Yes.
And because they're larval people. And Ross Perot was like the first eccentric billionaire of my political lifetime, right? I mean, H. Howard Hunt maybe or something like that. And I think it was Michael Kelly who described him as a Martian general taking bites out of himself, one soundbite at a time or something like that. Anyway, he was a weird dude. His son's a great guy.
But I will say, just and then I will shut up about this, I promise. In 1992, in the United States, there was, and I know this is true because I just wrote about it, about the origin of budget reconciliation. Again, I'm keeping the heater alive by talking about budget reconciliation out of a discussion of third-party candidates. But the budget deficit was a overwhelming concern in American politics in the late 1980s and early 1990s, because budget deficits were running as much as 3% of GDP, and it was a scandal. By the way, does anybody know what our budget deficit is going to be this year as a percent of our GDP? It's going to be 7% of our GDP this year. We are a fiscal basket case where we should be humiliated as a people that our government is, that 7% of our economy is borrowed money from the federal government.
And the national debt is coming up. If it's not 100%, it's like 100.
No, we're past
103 or something.
But Jonah, we're going to grow our way out of it. Haven't you heard the good news that when the big beautiful bill comes in, the economy will grow so fast? We'll probably balance the budget next year. It's going to be that good. But in the early 1990s, people were so offended by the debt that came, the deficits that had come out of the Reagan years, and Ross Perot saw that he had an issue with that. And he talked about globalization, and he talked about NAFTA, and he talked about those other things. But he was laser focused on the debt. And it was something that people can relate to, that they can understand. And he used the fact that he was a billionaire and fascinating, because they would have him on TV. And he just talked about the debt. And people do feel ashamed when their government is a debtor, right? And we went through the whole conversation in the past, in your lifetime, about modern monetary policy and how it doesn't matter actually whether we have a debt or don't have a debt. Normal people understand that it's immoral for your government to spend more money than it has. And Perot zeroed in on it. And I would argue that the effect of Ross Perot was that we did balance the budget. And that at the turn of the century, the political will was present because Bill Clinton had benefited by Ross Perot, and he saw the power in that. So he had his first, in 1993, had his first budget, and it was a doozy, but with a bunch of tax increases and other stuff. But it put the country on a different path. And you remember was it at Andrews Air Force Base? They basically had a lock-in with congressional leaders, and they went down to Andrews Air Force Base, and Newt Gingrich and the eyebrowless one from Missouri, Dick Gephardt, and they basically did a lock-in and balanced the budget. And when I got into it in 2000, the central argument in the 2000 presidential election, which is hilarious to think of now, the central argument in the 2000 presidential election was, what will we do with our budget surplus? And Al Gore wanted to put it in a lockbox. We're going to put it in a lockbox. We're going to put the money in a lockbox to cover future gaps with Social Security. And George W. Bush wanted to give everybody a tax break. And that was the biggest issue in the 2000 election. And that will tell you, and I think it wouldn't have been that way had it not been for Ross Perot.
Speaking about Gore, which is something like
All the time.
no one ever says. Do you remember The Simpsons where they found the talking Al Gore doll at the World's Fair?
I do.
Do you remember what it said?
No.
When they pulled the string?
No.
Al Gore said, "This is what I sound like when I talk." And that was it. Because Al Gore was among the most boring human beings in Christendom. And I say, I should clarify. I wrote a very popular column years ago when I say one of the most boring human beings, raising the prospect that he was in fact an alien. And
prove he isn't.
Well, so part of my argument was born almost exactly 9 months after the incident in Roswell, New Mexico. At one point, there's a famous story among incredibly obscure political nerds where he apparently called the editor of the Washington Post to complain about a picture of planet Earth from space on the front page of the Post. It was like taken by a satellite or something like that. And he ripped it into the editor of the Post by saying that, basically, you moron, don't you understand that your picture of Earth is upside down?
Upside down.
And it's like, there's no such thing as upside down in space, right? And but if you grew up someplace else with a certain view of Earth, you have an expectation about what which pole is where.
The Venusian view.
Exactly.
Of Earth.
Yeah, and there was other rock solid evidence.
I do think it bears pointing out that when Brother Goldberg and I were each getting into the news business, the central complaint that people your age, our age at the time, had about American politics was that there was no difference between the parties, that it was these two indistinguishable kind of versions of the same thing, and it was boring, 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 and all that stuff. And we got what we wanted. We got a much more interesting politics. We went from a deadly, crushingly boring kind of politics where, and I think about this often, George W. Bush, long before he was governor of Texas, when he was in his 20s, maybe 30 years old or so, got a DUI while he was in Maine, at his family's compound in Maine, and he got a DUI. And it was leaked on George W. Bush 2 weeks or something before, 3 weeks before the presidential election. And you could see it in the polls. It had this negative effect and all of this stuff. And it was a huge story. It was a big, big deal. And now it's like, who cares about anything? Like the who cares about anything, LOLZ, nothing matters. There's nothing that could come out on anybody that would be seemingly shocking anymore. And I yearn for the days of a boring. There's a lot that was wrong with Al Gore as a candidate, no doubt, but I do yearn for a politics that is as boring as Al Gore again.
No, I think that's right. Like Chris and I are the kind of people who, so like most normal Americans typically don't rush to turn on cable news. They do so when a flight goes down, there's a terrible flood in Texas, which all our hearts go out to. When there's some sort of crisis, a cruise ship full of passengers with explosive diarrhea.
Defecating in their suitcases. I remember the story very well, sir.
That was great stuff.
Very well.
And simpler times. And we're the kind of people who get really pissed when like there's breaking news and all of a sudden Americans are interested in the news because we actually just want the boring punditry stuff. And I think it's sort of telling that Ross Douthat's, it's a good title for his podcast, is called Interesting Times. Interesting Times. Which is a clever reference.
So can I offer, you afforded me an insight. So the Dispatch is doing a very cool project, which we're definitely ripping off for my Sunday morning television show. But around the coming of the 250th of the founding, the Dispatch is doing, and I commend Brother Goldberg's piece on this highly, but doing all of this around the 250th, it's a running symposium. What's the name of it?
The next 250.
The next 250. And doing these pieces and thinking about this in a constructive way. And I think that's very good. I think we need a good 250th year as a nation. So I wrote this piece about the speech that Calvin Coolidge gave on the 150th anniversary. And it's such a good speech. It's so good. And I was reading it and I was getting, just as Chris Matthews would have said, a thrill up my leg reading Calvin Coolidge's remarks. And what he did was rooted the American founding in the Great Awakening of the religious, the wave of religious revival that swept across the colonies in the late 17th, starting in the late 17th century, but from Jonathan Edwards forward and all of that stuff, and how the founding was connected to those ideas of Protestantism and the spiritual basis for the founding. And a couple things struck me. One was, I was surprised by how nakedly religious he was and how spiritual he was in the speech. I'd forgotten that. But then something else occurred to me, which is, and I know this is a duh for you people because you people go to good colleges and you've thought about these things and everything. And I knew it intellectually, but I didn't feel it. I didn't understand it. That the central debate actually that's happening in American politics right now is whether or not there are natural rights and whether or not God gave us rights, right? So if the American creed is, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, the endowed by part is something I take for granted. I'm a person of faith. I take for granted, and I assume everybody does. But that's not true. And it was certainly true that when I was younger, that people on the left didn't, people who don't, or people who are atheistic, and they may believe in natural rights, but not God-given rights. But I think I realized something, which is there are a lot of people who are theistic, who are on the right, that don't believe in natural rights. And that sort of shook me. And it spoke to, I think, the problem on the American right and the discourse on the American right, because we have the people who say that America was founded with this vision in mind, which is the household I grew up in, versus people who say, actually, God is real, but he didn't give you any rights. And the fact that that point of view exists on the right, and Coolidge gave me that, and you gave me that by letting me write that piece.
So the Calvin Coolidge, my standard take on the Declaration of Independence, well, first of all, pro. Second, that one of the most, I'll do it this way. The three best statements on the Declaration of Independence are, in order, the Gettysburg Address, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream, March on Washington speech, and then Calvin Coolidge's 150th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration. And the reason why Lincoln's is so important, the most important, not to go all Harry Jaffa on your asses.
It's about to get deep.
But is that when the Declaration of Independence was signed, the most important thing about it was the ending. Independence, right? That was the news. It was like, America's breaking off from the British Empire, right? As Tommy Lee Jones said in the underrated helicopter action movie classic Firebirds, we had our heads and our hearts wired together for some full tilt boogie for freedom and justice. And it's Abraham Lincoln who says, actually, no, it's the beginning that's the most important part.
Yeah.
And that's actually this is the mission statement of the United States of America. And then the reason why Martin Luther King's speech is so important is that what he was doing is very different than the way a lot of people talk about identity politics today. He was speaking to, I hate phrases like white America, but he was speaking to white America, which was, the vast majority of Americans then. And he was saying, you are not living up to the best version of yourselves. He was saying, this is what you guys take so much pride in, the Declaration of Independence, this idea that we are all created, endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights, that we're all equal before the eyes of God and government. You say you believe this stuff, you had this thing, he calls it a promissory note, and you're not living up to it when it comes to Black America. And he appealed to the best nature, the best versions of white America and said, you're not living up to your own ideals. And that was incredibly powerful, and that's what starts the civil rights movement. And the reason why Calvin Coolidge's is most important is for the passage that you quoted in your piece, which is simply that if you believe that your rights come from God, not from government, if you believe that the fruits of your labor belong to you, if you believe that the legitimacy of the government and the power of government is derived from popular consent, if you believe in the idea that you have these rights of speech and assembly and all these kinds of things, and that, again, they're granted by God, then that's final. You can't improve upon it. You can't come up with another system that says something different. And I thought it was interesting, Ken Burns, the documentary guy, I didn't think I would hear it from him. He said over the weekend that the American Revolution was the single most important event since the fall of the Roman Empire, something I believe. And so this gets us to sort of the state of, which is what Chris is talking about when he says a lot of people on the right are giving up on natural rights. Almost every form of ism that you guys get told in college is path-breaking and new and interesting and transgressive and hip and cool and exciting, whether it's post-liberal right-wing nationalism horseshit, or if it's sort of neo-Marxism, super clever, sees the means of production, Zoran Mondami nonsense. Any of that stuff, socialism, fascism, communism, Nazism, thisism, thatism, they are all older ideas, less radical ideas than the idea that this country was founded on. They're all reactionary. Communism is tribalism for one class. Socialism is also tribalism essentially for one class. Fascism is tribalism for either one state. Nazism is tribalism for one race. They're all forms of organizations that say the state should be the expression of sort of our tribal identity, and anything that we want to do is with our will to power, we should be allowed to do without any checks on it. And the American system says, slow your roll, no. We are all equal in the eyes of God and government, but we all get to pursue happiness as we see it, because the pursuit of happiness is an individual right, not a collective right. And that is the most radical idea in politics in human history. And prior to that idea taking hold, poverty in the world was natural. The average human being everywhere in the world for 12,000 years since the agricultural revolution lived on no more than $3 a day, anywhere in the world. That changed once and only once in all in human history, and it changed because of this basic, what you can call it the Lockean revolution, the miracle, whatever you want, but this basic idea that we are citizens, not subjects, that the fruits of our labors belong to us, and that we're all equal in the eyes of God and of government. And that is the entire story about why America is the most successful and prosperous and rich nation in the history of humanity.
Yeah, and we had to get really lucky also, right? Good ideas. There are a lot of people that had good ideas.
And we had good real estate.
Yeah, we got really lucky because we only got one chance in the story of humanity for to do it for the new founding, and the Munster Revolution. There are lots of instances of people trying new foundings in old places, but for Europeans who came here and found a mostly unpopulated continent, and a new founding was possible. And the fact that the continent on which they undertook the new founding was incredibly expansive and wealthy. You know, when Benjamin Franklin and this is the 1740s, certainly into the 1750s, predicted that the future was that the British Empire, the seat of the British Empire, would be in North America because it was just too rich, it was just too big, it was just too good, and that the center of gravity would have moved. And that was the vision that he had for Britain, was that basically it would be like Constantine refounding the Roman Empire on the other side of the Bosphorus, that it would just move and be over there. And so we were very fortunate in real estate. We were very fortunate in timing. You know how, I don't know what I guess maybe it would be college dropout for Kanye, but I use the example of the Van Halen 1984. There's a moment in the development of a band or an artist where it's like they haven't been given total hand to do everything they want all the time and be super self-indulgent. There's enough creative tension, but they're at the height of their powers. And the Yes album or Van Halen 1984, whatever, it comes usually fairly early in the process. The timing of the founding of the United States in the course of the Enlightenment and what was available and what wasn't available and excess had not been reached. The poor folks in France found out what a difference 20 years could make between getting your revolution started. So the propitiousness of the timing, the favorability of the location, all of this stuff. And, my crusade for the next year is I'm afraid that a lot of people not only are not appreciative of that and don't understand how rare and unique that was, but worse, they believe that the way that things are couldn't get worse, right? When I talk to a lot of young people, I hear a lot of, well, it's so, it couldn't get any worse. It couldn't get any worse. Oh, it could get much worse. It could get much, 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 much worse. We have a lot of problems. We have a sclerotic Congress that won't do its job. We have rampant corruption in the executive branch. We have misfeasance and malfeasance everywhere. We have institutions that are not working. We have people dropping out. We have corrupted informational flows. We have all of these problems. It's all true. We're just getting warmed up on ruining a civilization and a society, right? It's not like this is as bad as it can be, so who cares?
Hey, look, man, Rome wasn't burnt in a day.
Exactly. And the depredations and degradations that would be ahead for us if we continue on the path we're on, it's not like we die of a massive heart attack on the 17th fairway and keel over and people go, well, what can you do? He died doing what he loved. No. Generation after generation of a downward pull into worse and worse and worse. And at the end of everything always is tyranny. And at the end of every death cycle for every civilization is tyranny, because that is the natural state of man. The natural state of man is anarchy that leads to tyranny, and that's how it goes. So when you go back to where you go to school, please remind people, if you think this is bad, get ready for what would it be? That would be the Jasmine Crockett v. Matt Gaetz presidential contest. Get ready for it. There's so much worse in the future if you guys don't bail us out of this.
Now, here's my prediction. It's going to be Zoran Mandami versus Elon Musk. And Democrats are going to say it's outrageous that the Republicans are running someone who wasn't born here, because you're not allowed to run unless you were born here. And the Republicans are going to say it about the Democrats, but they're going to ignore it for their own candidates.
Right. Exactly.
And, yeah, so we didn't mean to get this dark.
Sorry I had to go there.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem is, and I get a lot of grief from my listeners for I talk about how how exhausted I am with politics. And the thing is, I cheer up when I talk on the podcast. The second the mic goes off, I just start cutting myself. And we're both sort of sick of it. And it's a problem. But we can still do the rank punditry stuff on the sort of convergence of serendipitous technology and ideas. The reason I was looking up, I was trying to remember the name of the guy. Years ago when I was a television producer, we did an interview with this guy, John Keegan, who was, until he died, considered the most respected military historian alive in the English-speaking language. And he's really a fascinating guy. And the host of the show I was producing asked Keegan who the deadliest warrior in human history was. And he had this great answer. He said, the certain tribes of the Plains Indian from 1863 to 1890 or something like that, and he explained it was the perfect confluence of the introduction of the horse into North America,
The Remington rifle.
And the already existing culture of those Indians who knew how to live off of the land. And so the amount of money the American army spent trying per brave was just astounding. It was like more lethal than the SS, more lethal than the Trojans or the Spartans or anything like that. And I always think about these convergence of things. All right, I think we should probably, before we get even darker, move into a Q&A kind of thing,
Yeah,
you think? Or,
absolutely. Unless there's any rankness that you want before. How much do you want to keep talking about the big, beautiful bill, Jonah?
I really hate it so much.
How dumb of a timeline do you have to be in where you're just calling things like, what do you, it's a real idiocracy moment when you're like, what do you call your legislation? It's the One Big Beautiful Bill Act.
Yeah, it's, and it's not to say there isn't good stuff in it.
Some of it is beautiful.
Not beautiful. Like, there's a reason why, it comes from Bismarck, right? But there's a reason why there's that cliche about watching legislation get made. It's like sausage making and legislation making. You don't want to watch it because it's really gross. It could be the greatest piece of legislation since Hammurabi's Code.
It's not.
It's not. And well, let's not exaggerate how great Hammurabi's Code was. If you ever go back and read it, I did for my last book, and it's famous because it was first. But there's a lot of eye gouging and hand cutting off, and like getting to do unspeakable things to people who did unspeakable things to your daughter. I mean, it's not menschlich.
You're not trying to put it into effect, is what you're saying.
That's right. Although I think, when Donald Trump was asked what his favorite Bible verse was, and because Donald Trump has a completely thumbless grasp of Christianity in the Bible, he was terrified, and he said, "Look, there's just so many. I like so many of them." And he was like, "Well, you pick one." And he says, "Well, if I had to pick one, I don't know, probably an eye for an eye,
a tooth for a tooth."
Which, look, last name's Goldberg. I'm not an expert on Christian theology, but pretty sure that wasn't Jesus' favorite biblical passage.
We did a whole reboot, and in the 2.0, we definitely were not doing eyes for eyes, teeth for teeth.
All right, with that happy note, why don't we go to Q&A, because we're a spent force up here. Yes, sir, my friend from Claremont.
Okay, if I could bring you a step behind your sort of Toynbee Spengler meditations on America falling to third parties.
Okay.
You talked a lot about the spoiler effect. Lots of people talk about the spoiler effect. But one of the perhaps less discussed, although you did mention it, Mr. Stirewalt, abilities of third parties is to bring different issues into the stage and to incorporate them into major party platforms. For instance, the Populist Party of the 1890s brought about so much of the typical left-wing policies, from nationalizing railroads to free silver, and then eventually disappeared because those became the policies of the Democratic Party after 1896. Say the American
Claremont,
Party
coming at you hard.
say
My wife went to Claremont. I'm not surprised at all.
I spoke at Claremont a couple months ago, and he was at my table.
Not surprised that you're throwing it around like horseshoes over there. I see you.
Say the America Party does get to that point and has several representatives, or some success, or just enough success to spoil an election, so that they might be able to make demands in terms of policy to the major parties. What sorts of policies could you see actually coming out of some sort of an Elon Musk, Mark Cuban, Andrew Yang coalition thing? Like it seems like it's going to be.
What was the original name of the Republican Party?
The Free Solar Party.
Was the very catchy Anti-Kansas Nebraska Party, right?
Well, that was in the Midwest, yes.
Right. This guy, I tell you what.
I know.
I tell you what, I don't know. The Anti-Kansas Nebraska, so the Kansas-Nebraska Act was the triggering event that created the crisis that grew out of the sectional crisis, that all of this stuff led to the moment, and the Whigs couldn't answer the question, right? They could not, their political coalition would not allow them to answer that question. And the need arose. So what's the need today? What is the issue that is not being answered that there is this need for. And the only thing that comes to mind for me that could break through on that issue is basically the same thing that drove the Reform Party before, which is the perception of mass corruption and the perception of the system is so dysfunctional and neither party is able to address it within itself.
Yeah, I think that's largely right. Look, I mean, Elon's stated argument for the American Party is runaway spending. And the fact that both parties believe in runaway spending and don't actually get much pushback from their own partisans or from the middle suggests that I just don't think it is a burning issue. I mean, the way I put it in my column, because I brought up, the Whigs were split on slavery and there was a market demand for a party that took an anti-slavery position. I would love for there to be a green eye shade populist movement that came up and said, get rid of debt spending. It doesn't feel like it's a thing right now in terms of a overriding movement. What could change that is events.
Yeah.
Events can really bite you in the ass. And let's say the bond vigilantes tank U.S. treasuries, which it's not happened yet, and you don't know when it's going to happen, right? It's sort of like the land shark from Saturday Night Live. You just never know when it's going to come at you. But like really dated references.
I was going to say.
But you could see a global financial crisis that all of a sudden wakes people up to the need for a responsive party. You can see both parties caving on, not rising to that occasion, and something emerging up.
If there would have been a party, if there would have been a movement afoot like that in 2008, right? So after those bank bailouts, after the TARP went through, and I did note that I think it was last summer, George W. Bush said that was it. That's when we got rolling on the populist moment. I think there's a lot of truth to that those bank bailouts, and I think the bank bailouts were just morally offensive to people as they were watching their home prices be destroyed. So I think if you had some option at that point where somebody was doing that, it's possible. And I don't think you need the bond vigilantes when Social Security comes pounding at the door, when Medicare, Social Security are pounding at the door. And the question is, are we going to jack up taxes on half of the country or stop paying out Social Security or Medicare benefits? And that fight is going on. I think that's a moment where you could see a free soil or anti-Kansas, Nebraska.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, and I don't think Chris will disagree with me, is that we live in a really, the technical term from social science is really stupid time. And so many people have had their brains rewired by social media and by life living in screen world and all that kind of stuff that, and this is a point that Ross was making to me this morning, is that if you were going out there to recruit candidates for this America Party thing, to run for House and Senate races, which I do think is the smartest strategy. I mean, it's probably a doomed plan, but it's the best way to pursue it. And you don't want to pick the really promising Republican or Democratic state legislator or something like that. You don't want to pick a bunch of Elon Musk mini-me's, Blake Masters, Man K kind of people. What you want to do is find people who have a cult of personality of their own at state or local level that sort of transcends party politics.
Jesse the Body Ventura.
Yeah. Well, as Jesse the Body Ventura typifies, it's all monkey paw wishes as far as the eye can see, right? And for those of you who don't know the reference, the monkey paw is a short story where you get your wish, but of course it ends very darkly and badly. And Jesse the Body Ventura was a buffoon and a weird demagogue. But that's a model where if you get these people elected to the Senate, they could then maybe introduce some, ideas that get picked up, but I wouldn't hold my breath for.
But what do we really need is primary election reform. Yeah. Everything else is secondary to we need profoundly primary election reform It's been a 55-year experiment. It's been a catastrophe. It has made our politics steadily worse. And one of the reasons that we have the debt and deficit that we do is if you only care about debt and deficit when the other party is in charge, then you don't really care about debt and deficit. And that's how we went from being shocked when a deficit was 3% of GDP to not caring, basically, or barely even pretending to care when it was 7%.
Yeah, so like we're in a bit of a bind here, is because a lot of listeners know really, really well where me and Chris come down on a lot of these things. A lot of these things are bingo card things, and you guys may not know this, but if we could snap our fingers and do two things to fix our political system, at least 2 of the 5 would be, because I don't want to speak for you too much, but I know these 2 would be on there, would be doing something to undo the campaign finance stuff, which you talked about earlier, and getting rid of primaries.
Well, I would increase the House of Rep. If I had,
That's another one of mine.
If I had only 2, I would. And I've come to a conclusion about what has to happen to the primary election system, or what should. Nonpartisan, multi-partisan, transpartisan primaries with top 2 finishers. And I think you can rank choice the primary, but not the general. But I think put everybody in the same pool at the beginning, the California system, and the top 2 that come out, that's who goes to the general. I think having it be a runoff, the general as runoff, is where I have landed, because I know I won't get what I want. What I want would be to not have elections for the parties to choose their nominees, but for the parties to choose among themselves, whether it be by caber tossing or feats of strength, or just smoke-filled rooms, whatever, don't care. But if there has to be a democratic component of candidate selection, then I think everybody in one primary and the top 2 that come out, and that those 2 run in the general election, I'm there. I'm ready. I want it.
Yeah, and you're just letting practicality intrude in the. If we're casting wishes here, it's they bring back conventions and smoke-filled rooms.
Hell yeah.
And because there is this long-standing misunderstanding of democracy. Democracy is great for the things democracy is great at, right? So like but things where democracy is inappropriate, democracy kind of sucks. And
there's your pull quote. Democracy kind of sucks.
And so the consensus used to be among political scientists in the 1950s, including one of my favorite political scientists, E.E. Schatzsnyder, just a fantastic name. And they thought that democracy is a thing you have between the parties, not within the parties, right? No one thinks that a Marine platoon should take a vote on what shield to take, right? No one thinks that everybody in a business gets an equal vote about what products to come out with. But somehow we think because parties are in the business of democracy that therefore they should be internally democratic. And what that has done is that has created a stranglehold among primary voters who are, there's some great social science on this, are actually don't like their own party very much. They just hate the other party more. And so they end up, if you want to get elected in a very red or very blue district or a very red or very blue state, you're running in a primary, in an open primary, if you say, the first thing I'm going to do when I go to Washington, if you elect me, is I'm going to work with everybody, including people across the aisle, to do the best things possible for my district or my state, you will not win that primary. If you say, in AOC's district or in Marjorie Taylor Greene's district, the first thing I'm going to do when I get to Washington is I'm going to rip the heads off the opposition and use their skulls as a war goblet, you very well may win the primary. And that creates an incentive structure that sucks. All right, questions. We should get back to questions. Yes, sir.
Early on, you were.
Why don't we actually start? We identified the other guy.
Who are you?
Where are you and what's your name and
My name
justify
is
your
Muthu
existence.
Meenakshi Sundaram. I'm from the University of Minnesota Morris. I'm going to be a senior. Early on in your comments, you were dismissive of post-liberalism on the new right, which you might be right to do. But generally, I want to hear more of your developed thoughts about post-liberalism and maybe some of the merits, because when you were talking about the slip of a civilization and the gradual decline towards tyranny, I was thinking about if we want to rescue our civilization and bring it back towards a regime of ordered republican liberty, well, we can't get there overnight. We have to go back in steps where we might have more tyranny or more authority than we're actually comfortable with in the end product. And I see post-liberalism as signaling the virtue of that sort of a transition rather than saying that that's the proper end goal. So I want to hear more of your thoughts about post-liberalism.
I did not mean to be dismissive of it. I think it is a real threat, right? I think the idea of moving beyond the American concept of God-given individual rights. The reason institutions like AEI exist is because things that are conservative are not popular. That's the problem, which is what is popular is often not good, and what is good is often not popular, right? The reason that we have a Bill of Rights is that the founder said some things are so popular and so tempting to government that people will fairly demand it, right? They will fairly demand from their government that these abuses take place. We say we believe in the First Amendment, we believe in free speech and the freedom of religion. We do not like it. We do not care for it. And so they made a list of things, and they said, the Anti-Federalists said, no, the appeal of the curtailment of these rights will be so great that we must write it down because it will be irresistible. And the story on Jonah's theme about nothing is new, I don't know the interval at which this happens, but part of what Ross Perot was talking about was that the Constitution was no longer useful because the reason that Germany and Japan were going to defeat us was that they had modern, cool constitutions that were made after the Second World War and reflected modernity. And so that was the 90s version. And then there was the early 1970s, late 1960s version, and there was the mid 1930s version, and there was the 1912 version. And there's always the same version which says that the Constitution is not sufficient to our moment, right? And that was the free soil moment. This system is not sufficient to our moment because our moment is different than now. The problem of conservatism, of Coolidgean kind of conservatism, is that its proponents are selling something that is inherently unpopular. Because what you're telling people is, you can't have the things that you want. I won't let you have the things that you want. Barry Goldwater famously said that a government that is big enough to give you everything that you want is powerful enough to take it all away. And people don't want to hear that. What they want to hear is, we'll never touch the social safety net. We'll never do anything about that. We're taking that off the table. And they want to hear you say that you can have law enforcement to the extreme without any concerns about civil liberties, that all things can be possible, when we know from human history that it's not possible. And so what happens, the reason that Jonah called his podcast The Remnant, is that through these boom and bust cycles in American political life, the post-liberals are not new. There's nothing new about that. But in these cycles, what happens is a group of people, weirdos, form someplace here and say, okay, we don't want the light to go out. You know the story of the Irish monks? You ever think about the Irish monks and the preservation of Western civilization? They're there in their caves on the coast of Ireland, and they're making cheese, they're making beer, and they're transcribing the Bible. And the Vikings show up, and they take all the cheese, and they drink all the beer. And what do the monks do the next day? They get up, and they start transcribing the Bible again, because the language had to live. And it's hard for people to hear, but good ideas are their own end, right? And we need people who will keep the light on so that when the time comes that people become desperate after having tried everything else. What's the Churchill line about democracy?
Oh, it's the worst system except for all the others. Something
Except
like
for every other one that's been tried. Madisonian democracy is it. Coolidge was right. It's the top of the mountain. And people try other stuff for a while. And we hope that we get lucky and that when people get sick of how things are and they come back and say, does anybody still have that? And places like the American Enterprise Institute, places like the Dispatch, elsewhere, are there to say, if you want some, we still have it. We still have some of the OG, uncut, real deal version of that the founders had. And I think that's the job. I think that's the job.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I agree with all that. I agree. There are smart post-liberals and there are some really stupid post-liberals. And it's unfair to paint the smart ones with the stupidity of the dumb ones. But at the end of the day, people who say the Constitution is a problem, and Chris is absolutely right, it's almost every 30 years there's some movement that comes up and says we got to get rid of the Constitution. Or we need to transcend the Constitution, or the Constitution is no longer adequate to these times. And invariably, when you say you're against the Constitution or we need to put the Constitution aside, what you're really just arguing about is an argument for power. And a lot of the new right groups, not just the post-liberals, but the nationalists and the common good conservatives and the common good constitutionalism stuff, they remind me, I'm sure you have some experience this on your own campuses, where some kid doesn't get the job as the head of student government or the school newspaper or some magazine or whatever. And so they say, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna start my own group and just do my own thing, and I'll be the president of that. So I'll get the good title rather than being like the assistant deputy editor or whatever on this other thing. And that's what a lot of these post-liberal new nationalist groups is a way to be the biggest fish in smaller ponds and claim that somehow it's this great new idea, because that's how you raise money off of it. And some of the things that the post-liberals are pointing to, as problems, I agree that they're problems. I don't think getting rid of the Constitution is a great solution. And also, like I said before, democracy kind of sucks. The thing that democracy is great for is firing people. That's what it's for, right? There is this really idiotic, almost mythopoetic, German nationalist, Volksgemeinschaft horseshit argument that says whatever that 51% of the people vote on is somehow obviously the right thing, right? That somehow it has been consecrated by the Volksgemeinschaft and the spirit of the people, and therefore it is right. And there's a big part of Donald Trump's argument about how he has a mandate to do whatever the hell he wants because 49.8% of the people voted for him, and
biggest landslide probably ever, Jonah.
And
I don't know why you're diminishing it.
Mandates are a garbage concept, and there's no mention of a mandate in the Constitution. Every politician who's elected in a given election year has the same mandate, has their own mandate to do their job. But the point of democracy is it's sort of like why Jews and other immigrant groups and stuff educate the crap out of their kids. It's not to guarantee they'll be rich. It's to have a pretty good hedge against them being poor.
Yeah.
And elections, they do not guarantee great answers. They don't, like, the best person doesn't always win. The right issue doesn't win in a plebiscite or anything like that. But what elections do is they give you the ability to fire people and get someone new in there. And there's nothing, not a thing in any of the arguments from the post-liberals that deals with that problem. And if there's one thing that history has ratified as a lesson over and over and over again, is that you give people power without an argument and a mechanism for removing them, they come up with new arguments to keep power. And I don't trust any of those goobers with that kind of situation. And the real test that shows that they're less interested in the efficacy of their ideas than they are in achieving a certain amount of power, either institutional, cultural, or governmental power, is not, whenever I say this to them, they always roll their eyes. Why don't you guys start someplace small? Why, Rhode Island or some town? Build it on your,
Yeah.
Show me, like, go Amish on us and show us that your ideas are better and that they work at small scale, and then make an argument about how you're going to scale it up. But instead, you get these people who make this argument that somehow all they have to do is win one more election and they're going to turn America into essentially a papal state. And you have to be too stupid to be a spell checker at an M&M factory to think that that's a great idea.
And also, we remember Cincinnatus, we remember Mustafa Kemal, and we remember chiefly George Washington and venerate George Washington for doing what? For giving up power, right? For having the chance to take power and giving it up. We remember the exceptions. We do not remember everybody who ever tried to seize power, keep power, and not release it from their grip. And anybody who says, I just need to borrow your liberty for a brief period of time, and then later I will give it back to you in much better condition, don't buy it, right? Because the good ones never ask. The good ones never ask.
Yeah, I mean, in development, in democratic transition theory, the first election in a developing country is almost meaningless. The question is whether they have a second election. Right. Because the old joke is one man, one vote, one time. And you get these people who are elected, and then they stay president for life for 30 or 40 years. The last point on this, and again, it's a bingo card thing for this podcast, but like the post-liberals love to talk about how the Constitution is a neutral procedural document without any moral content. The Constitution is a profoundly moral document. You know how many people had to die from torture while being interrogated to come up with the Fourth Amendment, to come up with the rules of the Fifth Amendment? You know how many people had to be persecuted and literally martyred for speaking for their conscience to figure out that the First Amendment made some sense? If you don't think the right to confront your accuser is a moral position for a country to have, you don't know what you're talking about in terms of the history of tyranny in the world. Like the lessons of the Bill of Rights, the lessons enshrined in the Constitution are some of the most hard-won lessons in all of human history. And they represent this Enlightenment idea that we're no longer going to put differences of faith to tests of the sword. And to sort of turn your back on that because you're smarter than it, right? Because you have this great idea of running the government like a friggin' Silicon Valley tech startup is just so unbelievably ignorant and ungrateful for the sacrifices people made to give us the system that we've got.
That's like nuclear level harumph. I'm for that. That's good.
Strong letter to follow. Yes, sir. Glasses right there.
Hi, my name is Mike O'Malley. I go to the University of Florida. I just wanted to ask Chris if you could elaborate on what you meant by a certain section of the right not acknowledging natural rights, and what rights are you referring to, and what kind of sections of the party?
So the idea of the reason that I was struck by this when I was hanging out with Calvin Coolidge last week was it seems so right and it seems so correct to me. Yeah, that's what I learned, that God gave us rights and that the government's job is to protect the rights that God gave us, right? And I'd always thought of that as a conservative concept. But that doesn't work if you believe that authority is needed to create better outcomes for the society as a whole. Because individual liberty, God-given liberty, is, and I don't want to go all Aquinas v. Augustine. Jeff will get really upset if I turn this into Aquinas v. Augustine. But basically the question being of, do we have a noetic problem in our species, or do we have a soul sick problem in our species? What's the problem, right? Is the problem of human nature that we don't know enough, and that when we do know enough and we are instructed correctly, we will cease to be fallen people? Or is the truth that we have a hole in our soul and that human nature is human nature, and that it manifests itself over and over and over and over again? And those are the two basic views. I commend to you very highly the Yuval Levin's book about the Great Debate, which is between
Burke and Payne.
Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine, and two views at that point in the Enlightenment, at the beginning of America. Which of those views are you most drawn to? And the right has traditionally been on the Burkean side of the question, which is man is fallen. We do the best that we can while we can. But if man is fallen, then we can't put another person in a position of supreme authority over others because that person is fallen too, right? We have to be skeptical of authority because if we give anybody too much authority, it's going to be a somebody. There is no Aristotelian ideal of a philosopher king who we can entrust maximum power to. We must divide and limit power in order to protect us from human nature because human nature asserts itself even among elites. What has happened in the past 15 years is that on the American right, there has been a rebirth of the kind of, some people call it paleoconservatism or whatever, that says it's actually time that somebody was in charge. It's actually time that somebody was in charge, and it's actually time that somebody got in there and got this country by the scruff of the neck and shook it into shape and told these people what to do and make it happen.
Daddy's home, right? Was that one of those
Daddy's
memes?
home,
Yeah.
right? Daddy's home, and it's about time that somebody took control of this. And it's very appealing. It happened in the United States. Certainly, we saw it in the 1960s and 1970s. Things seemed to be spiraling out of control, and there was a yearning in America for strong authoritarian tendencies. Richard Nixon's presidency was an expression of a lot of this. I'm not here to tell you which policies are better. I do politics, I don't do policies. But I can say that the conflict that has arisen on the American right between conservatives, and I call them nationalists, but you can call them whatever you want, but between conservatives and nationalists is about the Enlightenment, and it's about whether or not these truths that we Americans used to say we believed were self-evident are self-evident and are true. And there are some people who say yes, and there are some people who say that people who think that don't know what time it is. And this is a consequential fight that is going to happen in this country over the next 5 to 10 years over people your age who are going to have to fight out the question of, I'll shut up by saying this. I really will. I swear, Jonah. I will shut up by saying this. Have you all read, I know you've read, and Claremont's read it. Have you read your Schumpeter? Are we familiar with Schumpeterian economics? Okay, here's well, I know some of you nerds have read Nietzsche, right? Yeah, I see some Nietzsche dudes in here, all right. So the Schumpeterian problem is that a society becomes so successful that it can afford excess elites. There's too many of you, right? Here you are, the next group of elites landing at the beachhead of life and success, and here you are, the gangplank's coming down on the ship, and you guys are getting ready to go off, and you find that the beach is very crowded because there's a lot of elites already there. And in a society that is rich enough to produce surplus elites, and Nietzsche talked about, was it the tyranny of the clerks? Mm-hmm. Or whatever. But the idea that we are a victim of our own success, and that the only way that you break out of it is that things get bad enough eventually, right? That you have enough breakdown, creative destruction, that the good ideas come back. I don't know how much creative destruction we're going to take, but I definitely think we are in a Schumpeterian phase of our life cycle.
Yeah, I want to do one more question, but I'll be brief. Paul Ingrazia, who's this 30-year-old gargoyle who's Trump has appointed to be special counsel in the Department of Justice, which is a really important position. There's a tweet from him where they're arguing about something about how he's talking about Trump, when he gets back into office, should should remove all the justices he appointed and install real loyalists and patriots. And then someone complained, and his response was that it was unconstitutional. And this guy, who's again going to be a very important, if he gets confirmed, which I don't think he will, in part because just the expense of putting in a belfry for him with his talons to cling on to. But his response was, Trump is the Constitution. Anyone who's not offended by that on the right are the people I'm talking about. Because that is just not only just incredibly creepy, head past the sphincter ass-kissing, it is also a complete inversion of what this country was founded on.
Did you see what Pam Bondi told the tech companies about the TikTok ban?
No.
I felt like I was huffing gas. She said in a letter to these companies that the TikTok law would not be enforced. It would be nullified by the president. It wasn't like what Obama did with DACA and was like, I don't want to say exactly what's going on here, but let's just say that if you have to be in this category, we're not going to be looking for you too hard, okay? Sweets, be good. Pam Bondi wrote to these companies and nullified a past and said it doesn't exist. You are held harmless in perpetuity because it interfered with the president's priorities on national security.
Yeah, that's not a thing. Just so you know, like it's not how it's supposed to work. It's wild. All right, last question. Yes, sir, in the middle.
I'm Thomas O, University of Pennsylvania. I'm a finance math major. I don't know too much about politics, but I do have a problem with like Burkean conservatism and the stuff you said, because the way I've seen it is, so this is a true fact. So innovation comes in waves rather than something that goes straight forward, right? It's not like a linear graph. Like you could say there was a wave with railroads, there was a wave when the internet came out, and now I will argue that there's a wave with the rise of AI. And because of this new wave, a lot of the stuff in the past, it's hard to use history or like the morals of the past to judge the ethics of today. And when you use, and that's one like the pitfalls I see with Burkean conservatism is you want to keep things stable and keep things the way it is, and that stifles a lot of innovation. It's such a unpredictable time that when we're like putting like limits on like what you said earlier on deficit spending, when you said it's immoral to have deficit spending. Well, there are like cases where like such as like interstate highways in the 50s, like that there are benefits of deficit spending. And when we're putting in like limits upon certain policies, because like that's the way it's always been, or it has worked in the past, I feel like really concerned about that, because the future is unpredictable. It's not gonna. I'm sure you like people always say like history repeats itself, but it's not exactly like that.
Okay, I think I get the question, or the if you want to remake your statement in the form of a question, or you just
Yeah. So I have trouble understanding exactly like what you're.
Okay, I think I get
No.
it. Do you think you get it? Okay, I think we get it. All right.
Okay.
I'll go first for a quick. Totally agree with you. Innovation is good. Wrote my last book, big on innovation. Big Deirdre McCloskey fan. Think innovation's awesome. Innovation was literally a sin for a lot of human history, which is why poverty was natural, and because it destabilized the established order. In Western Europe, it was the sin of curiositas, of questioning the established order. One of the things I love about this country is that we believe in innovation. That's all great. First of all, I think you get Burke wrong. Burke did not want to freeze everything in place. There's a lot of language in Burke about the necessity of reform, the necessity of considered change. But he's also, because he's a conservative, a measure twice, cut once kind of guy. Totally agree with you. There are times when deficit spending is appropriate, but you're supposed to make an argument for the specific thing that you want deficit spending for. Like highways made a lot of sense, particularly after World War II. Eisenhower was like, you know what was really useful? Would have been really great getting tanks across Europe is highways. So let's build those, right? That was a big part of the interstate highway system. That was an argument to be made. It would also help with industry and all these kinds of things. We are in a steady state period where just because we don't have, because of path dependence and laziness, we just take it for granted to borrow money in perpetuity. And there's not an economist out there who thinks that makes a lot of sense. And you know that because, unless you're talking about the modern monetary theory people who, basically
Mint $1 trillion coin.
Yeah, they believe in magic. And so, magic solves a lot of problems. And so my point would be, you're right, the future is unpredictable, which is why you want a constitution that sets up the guardrails about how you do things. Look, if Congress worked the right way, it's not that you wouldn't have legislation that deals with the moment, but you would actually have political buy-in because the committees would hold hearings, they'd bring in experts, they'd debate things, you'd have a political argument that the people would have a window on, and you would actually get informed legislation. The idea that somehow one person, even if I thought Donald Trump was a genius, which, spoiler alert, I do not, the idea that one man is smart enough to figure out all of these intricacies about the unpredictability of the future and how innovation is going to go is just crazy. And what you want is you want to have political leaders to have a debate where different interests are raised and tested with facts in an adversarial way to come up with best policies. And that, the Interstate Highway Act was written by Congress. All of these things were written by Congress back when Congress worked. Doing everything by fatwa, or diktat or ukas, is that how you pronounce it? From the executive branch is just really dumb. And so I hear all your concerns, but like the idea that somehow you're worried about too much conservatism holding back innovation. I don't see a lot of conservatism right now holding back AI. I don't see a lot of conservatism holding back innovation. I see a lot of innovation happening without many political leaders having any buy-in or say about it, thinking about worst-case scenarios and what could go wrong.
The American system is supposed to hold space for people to do what they want to do. That's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to preserve space for people to do the things that they want to do. And the idea of separation of powers and limiting of government authority is supposed to hold space for people to pursue happiness and do what they want to do. I don't think history repeats itself. I'm not familiar with history repeating itself. What I do know is that human nature is immutable and is unchanged. So in 10,000 years of civilization across 3 continents, we flatter ourselves to think that if we were to go to Sumeria, that we're a different thing than the Sumerians, man. We're different than the Sumerians. We're the same. They weren't dumb. They didn't know some of the things that we know, but they knew some things that we don't about whatever, right? The people of different times of the Roman Empire, or the people who lived in Greece, or the people who lived at any point in the past 10,000 years are the same as us, with the same human frailties and foibles. Our natures are the same. The American constitutional order is a system of government predicated on a knowledge of human nature. What the founders understood was what people were like. If you read the Federalist Papers, what they are examining most of all is, what are people like, right? How do people act? When we look through philosophers over those thousands of years, the ones that are useful to me are personally, right? People that tell me, how should I live to be better at my own life, right? How should I live to be better in my own life? But the ones we all need are the people who say, what are people like and how do we devise systems that hold it in check, right? When Hume tells us that reason is the servant of the passions, it has ever been thus and always will be thus. That means something for how we devise government, right? That we can't live in pure reason, and that's not possible. When Adam Smith outlines he didn't invent capitalism, but he described it. And that has implications for how governments work. So I don't think history repeats itself. And I don't think that the solutions of today are the same solutions that you needed for the Eisenhower interstate system in 1956. What I think is that human nature now is the same as it was in 1956, as it was in 1856, as it was in the year 56. And that the knowledge that whether it's Shakespeare or Saul of Tarsus or whatever you want, those insights into what human beings are like are valuable, and we should hold on to them.
Yeah, so with that, just to bring it back to Calvin Coolidge, which is sort of where we began.
Hell yeah.
Calvin Coolidge said these ideas are final, that they cannot be improved upon. And you say that, the questioner brings up how, you can't have yesterday's ethics today because there are new issues that come up. Well, ethics and morals are kind of different things, but regardless, the point is that if you actually have a commitment to the idea that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, I don't care what AI comes up with, that's still going to be true. And if you believe that the government only has authority because of the consent of the governed, that is going to be true no matter how bitchin' iPhone 2007 is going to be or whatever. And as Chris was saying, look, I mean, perhaps the most fundamental conservative insight of all is the idea that human nature has no history. That a person born today is no different than a person born 10,000 years ago. The only thing that changes is culture and institutions and technology. And if you took a baby from today and you sent it back 1,000 years to be raised by Vikings, it would grow up to rape and pillage the English countryside. If you took a Viking and you sent it to New Rochelle or something, it would grow up to be a dentist. And that's why Reagan says we're never more than one generation away from tyranny, because we're not born with it in our blood. We have to learn these things every single generation. We start over. And the lesson I think for you guys is that you're going to be buffeted and told, there are all these hip new ideas and you got to get with the program and all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to tell you have to be this kind of conservative, this kind of liberal, or this kind of progressive. But, I have this phrase for certain people that I call reading like a sophomore. And there's a tendency among a lot of people to think because they discovered an idea for the first time, that means nobody else knew this thing. It's great listening to Donald Trump. He talks this way all the time, where he says, nobody knows that Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. That's code for I didn't know Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, right? And so having just a little situational awareness that just what looks like a new idea to you may not in fact be a new idea, and you should kick the tires on it. And you should, Chesterton's fence is like, my go-to thing for everything. G.K. Chesterton has the parable of the fence where he says, and this gets to the answer about Burke as well, he says, there's a certain kind of reformer that sees a fence in the woods and doesn't know why it's there and says, okay, we should tear it down. And Chesterton says, no. If you don't know why the fence is there, the last thing you want to do is tear it down before finding out why it was put up in the first place. Maybe it's keeping zombies at bay, right? Maybe it needs to be 10 times higher. Maybe it needs to be thicker. Maybe it needs to be fixed, something like that. If you don't know why something is there, that doesn't mean you understand it. It literally means you don't understand it. And there are an enormous number of things that people, particularly your age, when they look at politics, they say, this makes no sense. And you're often right in the sense that it's stupid, but we didn't get there overnight. And so taking a second to think it through, to figure out why things are the way they are, will make you better at fixing those things. And then sort of the last point is, I hate that I've become like Mr. Don't run with scissors guy. I used to be the person that the responsible people on the right would say, Jonah, maybe you're taking it a little too far, right? You know, when I would talk about Alan Dershowitz taking Viagra and getting taller and that kind of thing. And now, because I'm out of an age, I started the Dispatch because we were trying to model behavior that we thought was missing on the right. You can go a long way in your life if you just follow the maxim of don't lie. And I mean that kind of serious. If you're going to be a journalist, just don't lie. Just don't say things you don't believe to be true. Don't write things that you don't believe to be true. And don't live by a lie. Don't like buy into an idea because it's cool or it's popular that you think it's nonetheless untrue. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn's got a great line about this. I'm thinking about getting it tattooed on my ass. And it basically says, you can resolve to live your life with integrity. Let your credo be this. Let the lie may come into the world, it may even triumph, but not through me. And if more normal people had this sort of remnanty idea of just basic integrity and how they dealt with each other and how they dealt with institutions, we'd be in a much better place than we are today. And I know that I sound like Charlie Brown's teacher when I talk this way to you, and just rah, rah, rah. But maybe some of you will remember it at some point, and it'll be of use to you. And with that, thank you all for being here, and good luck in the rest of the summer.
Thanks, guys.
Okay. I'll see you next time.
No, you won't. This is a podcast. Thank you.
Thank you.